Why does your daughter look exactly like me?" The words landed in the room the way a glass shatters on a stone floor. Everyone heard them. Nobody moved. Michael Bennett didn't flinch. He stood perfectly still, the way a man stands when he has been carrying something heavy for a very long time and can finally feel the weight beginning to shift. He looked down at Sophie, 7 years old, her dark, almond-shaped eyes wide, her small hand tightening around his with complete certainty and not a trace of fear. Then he looked back at Charlotte Hayes. A sad, gentle smile touched his face, the kind that carries more history than most people experience in an entire lifetime. "She doesn't just look like you," he said softly. "She's your daughter." Crystal chandeliers scattered light across the exhibition hall like sunlight through antique lace. Somewhere behind them, a champagne glass clinked. Someone whispered. The entire room seemed to stop breathing. Charlotte Hayes, CEO of Hayes Technologies, the woman whose name appeared on whiteboards from Detroit to Dallas, stood completely still. Her composure cracked like fine pottery dropped onto a kitchen floor. Her eyes drifted to the child's wrist. A small silver bracelet, tarnished with age, engraved with a single letter, C. She had last seen that bracelet 7 years ago, and the man standing before her in a borrowed blazer that didn't quite fit, with rough hands faintly stained by engine oil, had kept it safe all this time without asking for anything in return. Michael Bennett, 36 years old. His world consisted of grease-stained repair orders, the steady hum of an air compressor in a garage, and the sound of Sophie's laughter filling their small apartment on Birchwood Lane. He drove a truck with a cracked dashboard and a heater that worked only when it felt like cooperating. He packed Sophie's lunches every morning with a folded note inside, usually featuring a tiny drawing of a smiling sun wearing sunglasses because she had once asked him why the sun never looked happy in children's drawings. He had drawn it smiling every day since. It was Sophie's painting that had brought them here tonight. Love Makes Us Family. A citywide student art competition. An exhibition sponsored by Hayes Technologies. Michael had ironed his best shirt. Sophie had worn her yellow dress with the white buttons. Neither of them had imagined what was waiting for them beneath these chandeliers. Now, standing there with Sophie's hand warm in his, Michael found himself remembering something his late wife used to whisper. "Some things find you, Michael. You don't have to go looking for them." Whatever happened next, he already knew one thing. He would protect Sophie no matter what it cost him. What he didn't know yet was that this woman had crossed his path before, on a rainy night 8 years earlier, when her entire world had been unraveling. 8.5 years ago, Michael Bennett's life had looked very different. He had a wife named Emma, a small apartment that smelled like pot roast every Sunday afternoon, and a baby on the way. He wasn't wealthy. He never had been. But he possessed the kind of contentment that doesn't require explanation, the kind that comes from knowing someone you love is asleep in the next room and most of the bills are paid. Emma died on a Tuesday in February, complications during childbirth. The baby did not survive either. Michael never talked about it, not with anyone. He carried grief the way some men carry a wallet, always with him, never displayed. Instead, he worked. Days at the garage, nights driving his old taxi through rain, snow, and the particular loneliness that belongs to 2 o'clock in the morning when the radio plays songs you never requested. Some nights, he sat in the parked cab before going upstairs, not because he was tired, but because the apartment had become unbearably quiet. Emma used to hum while washing dishes, nothing specific, just a low wandering melody that meant someone was there. Without it, the silence had a texture he never learned to live with. He kept Emma's mason jar on the windowsill, fresh flowers every other Friday, cheap bouquets from near the checkout counter, whatever happened to be in season. Years later, Sophie would ask why he kept buying flowers for a jar that belonged to someone who wasn't there anymore. "Therefore remembering," he told her, "and remembering is a kind of love, too." She accepted the answer, the way children accept true things completely and without argument. Everything changed on a stormy Thursday night 7 years ago. Michael was sitting outside the hospital in his taxi when a figure in a long coat climbed into the back seat. No greeting, just an address. Michael started driving. 2 blocks before reaching the destination, he heard it. A sound so small he almost thought he imagined it. He pulled over and looked into the back seat. Curled against the upholstery, wrapped in a pink flannel blanket the color of a faded peony, was a newborn baby girl. Her eyes were closed. Her tiny fists were curled. Around her wrist rested a small silver bracelet engraved with a single letter, C. For 30 seconds, there was only the sound of rain striking the roof and city lights sliding across the windows. Then Michael reached for his phone and called the police. The police arrived. Statements were taken. The passenger who had left the baby behind was never identified. No mother came forward. No family filed a report. Weeks passed. After long shifts at the garage, Michael returned to the hospital wearing work clothes that still carried traces of grease from the day. He would sit beside the bassinet and simply be there. The nurses eventually started calling him the mechanic dad. He never corrected them. When the court finally declared the child eligible for adoption, Michael Bennett filed the paperwork alone. A folding table, a county office, a water-stained ceiling tile overhead. He signed every page without hesitation. He named her Sophie, after the lilies Emma used to place in the mason jar on their windowsill. What Michael could never have known was what had happened on the other side of that same night. Across the city, a 27-year-old woman named Charlotte Hayes had signed a temporary guardianship agreement under tremendous pressure. She trusted a man named Richard Cole, her father's longtime financial advisor, to keep her daughter safe until she stabilized the family company. Weeks, not years, that was what she believed. Richard paid someone to make the situation disappear without ever informing Charlotte. When she discovered what he had done, she hired investigators. 3 different firms over 4 years. None of them found anything. Eventually, she locked the loss away in a room deep inside herself and kept working. Raising Sophie alone was never picture perfect. There were nights when Michael fell asleep at the kitchen table with half-finished homework spread between his elbows. Mornings when he packed 2 identical sandwiches because he was too exhausted to think clearly. Once, he showed up to Sophie's Thanksgiving pageant wearing his garage uniform, a smear of grease still visible on his forearm from a craft project they had worked on together the night before. But he was always there. Every school performance, every fever, every nightmare at 2 in the morning when Sophie would appear in the doorway wearing socks and whisper, "Dad, the dark is too loud." He got up every single time. He sat beside her bed until she fell asleep again, even when he had a 5 o'clock shift waiting for him. He taught her how to draw using Emma's old colored pencils, still stored in the dented metal tin she had owned. He learned to braid hair by watching the same tutorial video 17 times. He repaired neighbors' cars for free, especially the single mothers on their street, the ones trying to hold entire households together through determination and a single paycheck. He never advertised it. He simply did it. Sophie noticed. Children always notice the things adults believe are invisible. One afternoon, she looked up from her coloring book and asked, "Dad, why do you fix Mrs. Patty's car for free?" Michael tightened a bolt on the kitchen chair he had been repairing and answered without looking up, "Because she's doing the hard thing alone. And when somebody's doing the hard thing alone, you help if you can." Sophie pressed her yellow crayon harder against the page, the way children do when something important settles into place before they have words for it. Michael said it often enough that it became part of the rhythm of their home. "Kindness is the strongest tool you'll ever have, sweetheart. It always finds its way back to you." Sophie believed him completely. When her school sent home a flyer for the citywide art competition sponsored by Hayes Technologies, Michael pinned it to the refrigerator with a pineapple magnet. "You should enter," he said. Sophie tilted her head. "What should I draw?" Michael smiled. "Draw what you know." She drew the 2 of them sitting together at the kitchen table, his rough hand beside her small one. Above the painting, she carefully wrote the title in neat looping letters, "Love Makes Us Family." She won first place. And that was how they found themselves standing beneath crystal chandeliers on this particular evening. Charlotte Hayes looked at Sophie with an expression Michael had seen only one other place in his life, the mirror the morning after Emma died. It was the expression of someone standing at the edge of something enormous and irreversible, with nowhere left to go except forward. What Charlotte was about to say next would shatter the polished, untouchable image she had spent 7 years rebuilding, right there in front of everyone. Michael told the story the same way he approached everything else in life, quietly, without embellishment, and in the exact order it happened. The storm, the taxi parked outside the hospital, the faint sound from the back seat that had stopped him cold, the pink blanket, the silver bracelet, the hospital visits after long shifts, the paperwork signed at a folding table beneath a stained ceiling tile, 7 years of packed lunches, braided hair, crayon drawings, scraped knees, school performances, and one man's steady, unwavering love. He didn't tell it as an accusation. He never raised his voice. He laid each piece of the story out carefully, the way someone empties the contents of an old cedar chest onto a bed when it is finally time for everything to be seen. Nothing hidden, nothing exaggerated, nothing left out. The room remained silent in a way rooms rarely do. Not the polite silence of a formal event, but the deeper kind, the suspended silence that comes when people stop pretending to be interested in the paintings on the wall and start paying attention to something real. Charlotte stood perfectly still through all of it. Her face remained composed, barely, like the surface of a pond in early spring that appears frozen until you notice the dark water moving beneath it. When Michael finished, she didn't speak immediately. Instead, she looked at Sophie. Sophie looked back, calm, serious, those dark almond-shaped eyes missing absolutely nothing. Then Sophie said, with the straightforward honesty only a 7-year-old possesses, "You have the same eyes as me." Something shifted across Charlotte's face. Something that didn't belong to the CEO. Something older, more vulnerable. Something that had been locked away for 7 years behind doors she refused to open. She turned slightly aside and pressed a hand tightly against her chest. When she finally spoke, the words emerged in pieces. 7 years earlier, Charlotte Hayes had been 27 years old. The company her father built was bleeding money. Creditors were circling. Her board of directors, older, wealthier, and absolutely convinced they knew better than she did, were actively discussing removing her from leadership. Pressure came from every direction at once. In the middle of all that chaos, she gave birth quietly and privately. She had never intended to give her daughter away. That was the truth she needed people to understand. She signed a temporary guardianship agreement because she trusted Richard Cole, her father's longtime financial advisor, a man she had known since childhood, to keep her daughter safe until she could stabilize the company. She believed it would last weeks, not years. Richard never protected her daughter. Instead, he paid someone to make the child disappear without telling Charlotte. When she discovered the truth, she fell apart in a way she had never allowed herself to before or since. She hired private investigators, 3 of them, over 4 years. She followed every lead, reviewed every report, chased every possibility until it dissolved into nothing. She found no trace of her daughter. What Charlotte didn't tell the room, what she had never told a single living person, was what happened every year on the anniversary of the last day she held her baby. Every year, she bought a birthday cake, a small one, always from the same bakery on Clement Street that had existed since before she was born. She brought it home, set it on the kitchen counter, lit the candles, then stood alone in the silence of her luxury apartment and said aloud, "Happy birthday." After that, she blew out the candles herself because there was no one else there to do it. 7 cakes, 7 birthdays. 7 years spent standing alone in a kitchen worth more than many people earned in a year, speaking into an empty room to a child she could never find. She buried the grief beneath ambition, beneath 18-hour workdays, beneath the relentless demands of a company that required her to be harder than ordinary people. For years she called it discipline. She called it strength. Standing here now, in front of a mechanic she had once overlooked without knowing anything about him, she finally understood the truth. It had never been strength. It had been the longest, loneliest apology she had ever made. She rebuilt Hayes Technologies from the edge of collapse and transformed it into a powerhouse. She convinced herself that if she became successful enough, visible enough, powerful enough, perhaps one day her daughter would find her. What she never allowed herself to imagine, because the possibility was too painful, was that her daughter might already be loved, already safe, already the center of someone else's entire world. A private DNA test was arranged within 48 hours. It confirmed what the silver bracelet and matching eyes had already told everyone. Sophie Bennett was Charlotte Hayes' biological daughter. Michael stood in the clinic hallway afterward with both hands tucked into the pockets of his jacket. He waited quietly. Sophie sat beside him on a bench, completely absorbed in drawing a horse on the back of a blood pressure pamphlet she had taken from a wall rack. When Charlotte emerged holding the test results, she looked like someone who had just been handed something precious and overwhelming and wasn't yet sure she was allowed to hold it. She looked at Michael. Michael glanced at the document. Then he nodded once. Charlotte released a long, shaky breath. The kind a person takes after carrying something heavy for 7 years and finally finding a place to set it down. Then Charlotte Hayes did something no board member, investor, journalist, or industry analyst had ever seen. She cried. Not quietly, not gracefully. The full weight of 7 years came crashing through all at once. The kind of crying that happens when someone has been brave for too long and suddenly runs out of strength. Michael didn't move toward her. He didn't move away either. He simply stood there steady, present, and patient, the way decent people do when someone nearby is falling apart and doesn't need advice or solutions, only witness. Eventually, Charlotte regained enough composure to speak. Her eyes drifted down to his hands. For the first time, she truly looked at them. Scarred knuckles, faint traces of engine oil beneath his nails, calluses formed by years of torque wrenches, cold mornings, and hard work. Hands that had packed lunches, braided hair, drawn smiling suns wearing sunglasses, bought cheap flowers every other Friday for a mason jar on a windowsill. Charlotte's voice barely rose above a whisper. How can someone with so little give so much? Michael looked over at Sophie. She was now carefully drawing a saddle onto her horse, the tip of her tongue pressed into the corner of her mouth in concentration. I gave her what I had, he said quietly. Turns out, that was enough. Charlotte looked at him for a long moment. For perhaps the first time in years, she had no prepared response. No strategy, no next move, just silence and something unfamiliar beginning to grow inside it. 3 days later, Charlotte Hayes made Michael an offer, and his answer forced her to confront everything she believed money and power could accomplish. The meeting took place on a Wednesday afternoon in a conference room on the 14th floor of Hayes Technologies. Glass walls, gray carpeting, a city view that cost more per square foot than Michael's monthly rent. Charlotte sat at the table, composed once again, the armor back in place. She slid a sealed envelope across the polished wood toward him. Michael didn't open it. He simply looked at her. $10 million, Charlotte said. A complete custody arrangement. A fully funded college trust for Sophie. Every resource I have access to. She held his gaze. You're a good man, Mr. Bennett, but you're a mechanic. I can give her opportunities you simply can't. Better schools, travel, a future without financial uncertainty. Step aside, and Sophie will never want for anything. The room became very quiet. Michael glanced down at the envelope, and then back at Charlotte. Money can't buy what Sophie already has, he said. A father who shows up. 7 years of showing up. That's not a role you replace with a wire transfer, no matter how many zeros are attached to it. Then he stood. He pushed his chair neatly back into place, the way someone raised with respect leaves a table. He turned toward the door. She knows one, Dad, he said without looking back. That isn't going to change. It was the first time in Charlotte Hayes' professional life that anyone had rejected her offer without hesitation. Not a single moment of consideration. Not even curiosity. After Michael left, Charlotte remained alone in that conference room for a long time. The envelope sat untouched in front of her. She stared out at the skyline as though it might provide an explanation. It didn't. For the first time, her power had encountered something it simply could not move. That evening, Sophie asked a question at the dinner table. She had been unusually quiet during the drive home. Normally, a 10-minute car ride gave her enough time to discuss everything from bird nests to whether clouds had feelings. Michael noticed the silence but didn't force the conversation. He made grilled cheese sandwiches, set the plates down, and waited. Finally, Sophie pushed a triangle of sandwich around her plate and asked softly, "Is that lady going to take me away?" Michael set down his fork. He had known the question was coming. He had been thinking about it ever since the exhibition. How do you explain something this large and delicate to a 7-year-old who deserves nothing except the truth delivered gently? No, he said. Nobody is taking you anywhere. Sophie looked down at her plate. But she's my mom. Michael nodded slowly. She's someone who loves you, he said carefully. The same way I do. Sophie frowned slightly. So who do I belong to? Michael leaned forward. You belong to you, sweetheart. Nobody owns you. Not me, not Charlotte. Love doesn't work that way. Sophie thought about that for a moment. Like how you always say kindness doesn't run out. Exactly like that. She took another bite of her sandwich. Then, after chewing thoughtfully, she said, She doesn't know how to braid hair, though. Michael laughed quietly. No. She definitely doesn't. Sophie nodded with complete seriousness. I'll have to teach her. Michael looked at his daughter, the little girl who arrived in his life wrapped in a pink blanket on a rainy night, and had never once doubted she belonged exactly where she was. "Yeah," he said softly, "I think you probably will." 6 weeks later, on a Tuesday night in October, Sophie's fever climbed to 103 degrees. Michael sat on the edge of her bed for hours with a cool cloth folded across her forehead. One large hand rested lightly on her back while he whispered the kinds of things people say to sick children when it's late. The apartment is quiet, and you need them to feel a little less alone. He hummed old songs Emma used to sing. He told slow, wandering stories about a family of ducks that lived beneath a highway overpass and held very strong opinions about puddles. He never slept. Around midnight, he heard the soft click of the front door. 2 weeks earlier, he had given Charlotte a spare key at the recommendation of Sophie's pediatrician, since she was Sophie's biological parent of legal record. He had not expected her to use it at midnight on a Tuesday. Charlotte appeared in the hallway and looked at him through the bedroom doorway. Neither of them spoke. Then she turned and walked into the kitchen. What followed was the sound of someone attempting, with complete sincerity and almost no practical experience, to make rice porridge from a package she had apparently purchased at a drugstore on the way over. A cabinet opened, closed, opened again. Something clinked. Then came a long pause, the unmistakable pause of someone reading cooking instructions very carefully beneath fluorescent lights. It took 45 minutes. The porridge emerged too thick and slightly oversalted. Charlotte carried the bowl into Sophie's room and placed it on the nightstand. Then she stood there. Michael looked at the bowl, then at her. "It's not terrible," he said. A strange sound escaped Charlotte. Small, surprised. It might have been a laugh. "Don't tell anyone," she replied. Michael fed Sophie slow spoonfuls until she drifted back to sleep. Charlotte settled into a chair in the corner of the room and stayed. The radiator ticked softly. Streetlight filtered through the curtains, laying a faint grid across the floorboards. Neither of them felt any need to fill the silence. Around 2 in the morning, Michael looked across the dim room at this woman who had arrived unannounced at midnight to make terrible porridge for a child she was still learning to know. He spoke quietly, not as advice, not as a lesson, but as a truth he had discovered through 36 years of living. Real success isn't sitting alone at the top. It's having someone waiting for you at home. Charlotte turned her head slightly away. Her jaw tightened. She pressed the back of her hand briefly against her eye. When she looked back, her expression was composed once again, but something behind it had shifted in a way that would never shift back. After that night, Charlotte started coming around more often, not formally, not according to any schedule. She would simply appear. Saturday mornings with grocery bags, she clearly purchased without consulting anyone 2 different kinds of expensive mustard, blood oranges, and once, memorably, a jar labeled artisanal honey butter that Sophie tasted carefully before announcing it tasted like a candle. Michael quietly placed it in the back of the cupboard and never mentioned it again. Charlotte sat at the kitchen table during Sunday dinners. She colored in Sophie's coloring books with remarkable precision, staying perfectly inside the lines. Michael suspected that habit had less to do with artistic ability and more to do with a lifetime spent controlling everything she possibly could. Slowly, she began letting the crayons drift beyond the edges. Their conversations deepened. They talked about her father's company, his years driving a cab, the loneliness that can exist inside a full calendar, the fullness that can exist inside a modest life. One evening, Charlotte asked a question so carefully phrased that she almost hid the real meaning underneath it. "Doesn't it cost you? Being kind all the time? Don't people take advantage?" Michael considered the question for a moment. "Sometimes," he admitted. "But the alternative costs more." Charlotte sat quietly after that. What she didn't say, what she was only beginning to understand, was that the faint scent of engine oil on his jacket had somehow become the smell of stability. The way an old porch swing that always creaks the same way eventually stops being a flaw and becomes the entire reason you love it. One evening, Sophie looked up from her drawing pad and said casually, as though the matter had already been decided, "I like it when she stays for dinner." Michael didn't respond. He simply smiled into his coffee cup. Within 10 days, a crisis would strike Hayes Technologies, and the person who would prevent the company from collapsing would be the same man Charlotte Hayes had once tried to pay to walk away. The news broke on a Monday morning. Hayes Technologies' new self-driving vehicle prototype had failed during a public safety demonstration in front of the company's largest institutional investors. It wasn't a minor malfunction. During a controlled test run, the braking system shut down without warning at speed. For 17 terrifying seconds, the vehicle continued moving without driver control and without any override response before technicians managed to stop it manually. No one was injured, but the footage spread across the internet almost instantly. By noon, the board had called an emergency meeting. By 3 o'clock that afternoon, the company's stock price had fallen 11%. Projected losses exceeded $50 million. More importantly, 412 employees, engineers, technicians, support staff, many of them parents supporting families on carefully balanced budgets, were suddenly facing the possibility of layoffs. Charlotte sat alone in her office that evening. The city stretched beyond the glass walls, glittering and indifferent. She had rebuilt this company once from the wreckage her father left behind. Sitting there in the silence, she honestly wasn't sure she had another rebuild left in her. Her phone buzzed. A text message from a contact saved simply as M. "I have an idea if you're willing to hear it." Michael arrived the next morning wearing his good jacket, the same one from the art exhibition that was still slightly too wide across the shoulders. He carried a legal pad filled with 3 pages of neat, handwritten notes. Without ceremony, he set it on Charlotte's desk. "A free community repair day," he explained. "Open to all Hayes Technologies employees and their families. I'll organize it myself. My tools, my garage contacts, my time." Charlotte stared at him. "That's your solution?" "People are scared," Michael replied. "Not just about their jobs. They feel like the ground shifted beneath them and nobody warned them. You address that first. You remind people someone sees them. Everything else gets easier after that." Charlotte looked down at the legal pad and then back at him. "You're going to fix cars? I'm going to listen to people," Michael said. "The cars are just the reason they'll show up," Charlotte almost argued. She almost pointed out that this wasn't a strategy you could present to investors or model on a spreadsheet. She almost said that feelings don't stop financial bleeding. But then she thought about Sophie, about a bowl of terrible porridge, about the kinds of results that never appear in quarterly reports. "All right," she said. Then, after a pause, she repeated it. "All right." This time she meant it completely. That Saturday, the Hayes Technologies parking lot filled with people, not with the orderly movement of a workday, but with the uncertain, hopeful energy of individuals who weren't entirely sure why they had come and were grateful they had. Michael worked from 7 in the morning until sunset painted the sky orange. Oil changes, brake inspections, transmission checks, a check engine light that turned out to be nothing more than a loose gas cap. That discovery made a tired young engineer laugh harder than she had in weeks, but Michael did more than fix cars. He listened. He moved through conversations the same way he approached everything else, without rushing, without distraction, giving people his full attention, the kind of attention that quietly says, "You matter right now." One engineer, a 29-year-old single mother named Grace, stood beside her car after Michael replaced a serpentine belt and suddenly began crying. Not politely, not quietly, the kind of crying that shakes your entire chest and surprises even the person doing it. She apologized immediately. Michael simply handed her a clean shop rag. "Take your time," he said. She did. After a few minutes, she wiped her eyes and straightened her shoulders. Then she said she needed to go back and review the prototype data one more time. There was something she hadn't been able to see clearly while she was frightened. She returned to the office that afternoon and started over from the beginning. This time, without panic clouding her judgment, she found something. Not an engineering mistake, not a design flaw, a deliberate line of code hidden deep within a secondary system branch. A line designed specifically to trigger brake failure at a particular speed during exactly the type of public demonstration that had taken place. Someone inside Hayes Technologies had sabotaged the project from within. Grace documented everything, removed the corrupted code, restored the original programming. The actual fix took 40 minutes. Finding the courage to look again had taken an entire Saturday and one mechanic who cared enough to listen. The project was salvageable. The jobs were safe. Charlotte watched much of the day through security cameras from her office. She watched Michael move from vehicle to vehicle. She watched Grace cry, recover, and walk back into the building with purpose. She watched employees eat sandwiches together beneath the late afternoon sun, talking and laughing in ways they never did inside conference rooms. She watched a man in a jacket that didn't quite fit give her company something no consultant, crisis management firm, or emergency board meeting had ever provided. He gave them back themselves. When Grace presented her findings to the board on Monday morning, sabotage confirmed, responsible party under investigation, system restored, the room fell into the kind of silence that follows genuine relief. Charlotte lowered her eyes to her hands for a long moment. Then she said quietly, so quietly that only the person seated beside her could hear, "He didn't just help my daughter. He showed this entire company that kindness saves more than power ever could." Buried inside the company's archived records was a discovery that would make every piece of this story suddenly, completely, and irreversibly whole. Charlotte found it in the oldest digital files. Hayes Technologies had maintained a community roadside assistance program since its earliest days. Her father had started it as a goodwill initiative, and Charlotte had continued it over the years the same way someone leaves a porch light on after dark, partly out of habit, partly out of hope. The record stretched back 14 years. Service reports, handwritten notes, expense forms, archived scans. She was searching for information related to the sabotage investigation when one particular entry caught her attention. Date: March 4th, 8 years earlier. Incident: stranded motorist, Route 9, during severe rainstorm. Service rendered by M. Bennett, independent contractor. Notes: vehicle non-recoverable, driver safely relocated at no charge. Beneath that, written in careful handwriting, were additional words. Driver appeared extremely distressed. Before departure, contractor advised, "Someone is waiting for you at home." Charlotte read the note twice. Then she sat completely still. 8 years ago. A rainy night on Route 9. A young woman driving her father's company car after an impossible board meeting. Crying too hard to see clearly. Pulling onto the shoulder because she no longer trusted herself to continue driving safely. A mechanic who stopped, helped, and said one simple thing that gave her enough strength to keep going. "Someone is waiting for you at home." She had gone home that night. 3 weeks later, under pressure she still struggled to fully explain even to herself, she made the worst decision of her life. But before that happened, a stranger's kindness on a rain-soaked roadside had carried her far enough to reach another morning. That stranger had been Michael Bennett, the same man who later found her daughter abandoned in the back of a taxi and chose, without obligation or reward, to love her. Charlotte sat for a long time holding the printed report. Slowly, she began to understand something she had never found words for. Real kindness never announces itself. It doesn't keep score. It doesn't demand recognition. It simply acts and moves on. Then sometimes, years later, you discover it was the hinge upon which everything turned. That evening, Charlotte drove to Michael's apartment. Sophie was already asleep. School night. Bedtime at 8:30. Michael treated routines the way a gardener tends soil, quietly, consistently, because that's how things grow. He opened the door, took one look at her face, and stepped aside. "Come in," he said. He didn't ask what was wrong. He simply put a kettle on the stove. Charlotte sat at the kitchen table beneath the pineapple magnet and the crayon drawings taped to the cabinets. Then she told him everything she had discovered, every detail, every realization. She didn't hide behind composure. She didn't manage the narrative. She simply told the truth the same way he always had. Michael listened. When she finished, he sat quietly for a moment. "I didn't know it was you," he said finally. "That night on Route 9, I never knew." "I know," Charlotte replied. "That's the part that gets me. You didn't do any of it because you knew who I was. You just did it." Michael looked at her. "That's what kindness is," he said simply. "You don't do it because of what comes back. You do it because the person in front of you needs it." Charlotte lowered her eyes to her hands, her carefully manicured hands, hands that had signed contracts, built a company, negotiated mergers, and fought off hostile takeovers. None of it came close to what this man had accomplished with his own hands. 2 ordinary moments, 2 rainy nights. No expectation of reward, no audience, no recognition, just kindness. "I don't just want to be Sophie's mother," Charlotte said quietly. Her voice was steady, but barely. "I want to be with you, if you'll have me." Michael smiled. Not a dramatic smile, not a cinematic one, just a real smile. Warm, slightly tired, entirely genuine. "Real love doesn't happen overnight," he said. It grows through kindness every single day. Charlotte nodded. I know. Then she met his eyes. I'm asking if I can start. Michael slid a mug of tea across the table toward her. You already started, he said. The night of the porridge. Charlotte laughed. A real laugh, the kind that catches you by surprise because it isn't rehearsed. The months that followed were ordinary in all the best ways. Charlotte stepped back from the relentless pace of her life, not completely, but meaningfully. She was at the dinner table on Tuesdays and Thursdays. She attended school events without checking her phone every 5 minutes. She learned how to fold laundry according to Sophie's strangely specific system, a system Michael had long ago memorized and no longer questioned. She learned how to braid hair, too. That process took much longer than 45 minutes. Sophie sat patiently in a kitchen chair, offering commentary while Charlotte attempted braid after braid. Michael watched from the doorway and wisely refrained from helping unless asked. He was not asked for 11 attempts. On the 12th, Charlotte finally got close. Almost, Sophie announced seriously. Keep practicing. With Charlotte's support, Michael opened his own garage. He filed the paperwork in the same county office with the water-stained ceiling tile overhead. This time, Charlotte sat beside him at the folding table. Michael noticed her glance up at the stained tile the same way he once had, like someone marking a moment worth remembering. One spring morning, Sophie wandered downstairs in her socks with her hair still messy from sleep. She found Michael and Charlotte sitting together at the kitchen table. Michael had coffee. Charlotte had a legal brief and a piece of toast. They shared the easy silence of two people who had stopped trying to manage one another and simply learned how to share a morning. Sophie looked at them carefully. Dad, Michael, she said. Then she pointed. Mom, Charlotte. She paused. We're a real family now, right? Michael looked at Charlotte. Charlotte looked at Michael. Then he reached across the table and took her hand, her smooth, careful hand resting inside his rough, oil-marked one. Yeah, he said softly. We are. 1 year later, Sophie stood at the front of a school auditorium presenting a new painting to the citywide art competition. The title was Times, My Family, Built by Love and Kindness. In the audience, a mechanic and a CEO sat side by side in folding chairs. Their shoulders touched. They held a program Sophie had decorated with smiling suns wearing sunglasses because, in her family, the sun had always been happy. This story reminds us that kindness is never a small thing. It doesn't stay where you leave it. It moves through time, through rainy roads, through 7 quiet years, through rooms filled with crystal chandeliers. Eventually, it arrives exactly where it is needed most. It reminds us that the truest families are not handed to us fully formed. They are built slowly, imperfectly, through the daily decision to show up, to stay present, and to tell someone who is struggling, I see you, take your time, someone is waiting for you at home. And sometimes, not always, but often in the ways that matter most, kindness finds its way back. In a silver bracelet preserved for 7 years. In a bowl of oversalted porridge at midnight. In 11 failed braids and a 12th that was almost right. In a little girl standing in her socks at a kitchen doorway, looking at two people who found one another along the most unlikely road imaginable, and choosing to call them family.